Well, the new book is Lost Words and Forgotten Worlds, Rediscovering the Dead Sea Scrolls. Could you start by just giving a definition to listeners of the Dead Sea Scrolls, what that encompasses?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Dead Sea Scrolls are at once our most ancient manuscripts for the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, as well as many other manuscripts. But they're also some of our most modern discoveries. So they kind of have this both and they were discovered in 1947 into the early mid 50s, starting off in one cave in the Judean desert, so on the northwest corner of the Dead Sea. And then it turned into about 11 caves. I say about because it was an ongoing discovery, and that discovery has even been going on for decades. Every now and then, something is a new chapter of the story, and maybe there was a new text, maybe there's a new cave, these types of things. But that first wave of discovery is those 11 caves. 930 or so fragmentary manuscripts were discovered. If you've ever seen the Dead Sea Scrolls or you Google them, I like to joke, but it's kind of a little too honest that these are mostly Dead Sea scraps. Like they're 2,000 years old, these materials, and things wear and tear. So there's some really iconic scrolls like the Isaiah scroll, which is like 7.5, I want to say, meters long, or the Temple scroll is about 8.2, if I'm not mistaken, meters long. Most scrolls are in fragments. So if you love puzzles, this is fantastic for you. If you hate puzzles, then do not get into scrolls. There's a lot there, but there's about 930 manuscripts in fragmentary form found about 75 years ago, starting in the late 40s to early 50s, and these include our oldest copies of many writings that eventually show up in the Old Testament, as well as interpretive texts from ancient Judaism and materials that are actually in Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic. So it's all of that's kind of the back of the baseball card stats on what are the scrolls. That's kind of the short story and what they are when they kind of came to light and the types of things we found in them.
What was the thing that hooked you
Yeah.
to I don't know, dedicating a career to this?
Yeah, I've only come to recently realize it's like I kind of just like old junk. Not to call the scrolls junk, but like old cars or old guitars or just thrift shops and bargain stores, and like I've always had that kind of part of me. But I grew up in the church and still have a relationship and a faith that's oriented to this. But I never really read the Bible. It sounds like I read it, but I never understood that, oh, you can read around it. This is kind of one book that has a larger story. Like, and those light bulbs were starting to go on when I was doing undergraduate in theology. And then I tell a bit of the story in the book, so spoil the whole deal. But I was an undergrad student in theology and had a chance to hear a few guest lecturers, and they were talking about these Dead Sea Scrolls. I had no idea what that was. I just knew it was a free lunch and a coffee or whatever. And that was the first time I heard someone really invite me into a space to go, no, there's stuff that you can explore today that has not been thought about, that we didn't know about. And it's very rare in research to be able to do something that's truly original. But these are manuscripts that even now, even though I've known about them for 75 plus years, there's just so many questions and insights that we're yet to really dive into. So that hook, like I said earlier, that kind of oldest and newest, that was pretty early on for me. It was like these are the most ancient things that you can dive into, and there's something new here that we haven't fully got everything out of it. That was a big part of it that hooked me in. That it's these aren't just ancient texts; they came into our world in kind of an unexpected way, and that really kind of invited me into a very long rabbit trail that I'm on now, decades later. But it's been a good one.
Can you think of any of kind of the most surprising things that you've read in the Dead Sea Scrolls or discoveries
Yeah.
you've come across as you've studied them?
Yeah. At first, like when I got into the scrolls, it was like, well, everything's strange, everything's weird, everything's unknown because it's totally different. Why is it totally different? One example of this is, that at first I'm like, well, that's odd. And there's a good reading strategy. I've heard others say this, but so I won't claim it as my own. But if you're reading the Bible, the scrolls, I think especially, it's like if it's weird, it's important. So go back and go back and have another look. One like this is the scrolls include many writings that are kind of interpreting and extending scriptures, like they're trying to make sense of them, and they're also this community. There's a scribal community that copied or collected the scrolls. they're trying to make sense of their world around them as well. So a lot of these writings are kind of what you might call sectarian writings, like it's about their kind of insider identity and how they're viewing the world. One of these texts is called the War Scroll, and it's their view of their eschatological expectations when God's going to show up, he's going to overthrow the Romans, and it's kind of like it's like a best of seven face-off, and then in game seven, God, wins and sort of the sons of light, this community. But in that text, they have all these details that to me as a reader, I was like, well, that's strange. Like one of them is it's very important that the outhouse, the latrine, is way outside the camp. Like they go out of their way with measurements and how far and everything. And at first, it's like it's kind of a throwaway, strange detail. But if you actually sit down and look at it, it's because they have an idea, their ideology of purity. Purity really matters in ancient Jewish culture. And this community viewed this best of seven face-off battle. They were going to be doing battles with angels in their midst. So all of a sudden, they're viewing purity and this understanding of human purity uh, relative to their toilet practices, which is again a daily practice for all of humanity. But now all of a sudden you've gone from, well, where's the bathroom to this eschatological view, this apocalyptic ideology, this understanding of how they commune with angels. You've gone from literally a one stall toilet outhouse to like 18 really cool questions you could explore about how is it that this one community is understanding themselves, the world around them, God's divine rule, and then how important are things like purity to them because it really mattered. So when I started reading the scrolls, I think my eyes probably glossed over all sorts of stuff like that. But then after, as you like most things, whether it's the scrolls, the Bible, or the book, by the time you've read it and dug into it, you start to get a feel for it and go, I think some of those things that I maybe glossed over, we're actually getting at something. And that's been kind of like an ongoing discovery as I go back and reread things. So, yeah, watch out for odd details and definitely go back and try to see if it's weird, it's important, like I said. And that was one of them that kind of came together like that in a surprising way.
Yeah, that's a good rule. Do you think it's over now? I don't know, the discovery of Dead Sea Scrolls, or do you hold out any hope that there could be more in this region or others that would be
Mhm.
discovered?
I don't think it's over. One of the big news stories in the last like 5 years, I would say, is about, new fragments coming to light. Unfortunately, many of those have been forgeries. So the story's not
Yeah.
over. It's kind of like an ongoing history. Now, so that's an interesting thing. Like, what does that say about this an antiquities market and private buyers and sellers that are willing to pay like tens of millions of dollars for, fake fragments? So that part of the story is ongoing. And there's been several attempts over the last several decades to keep looking in the wilderness for scrolls and caves. Um, I don't think it's over, but to me, the big discovery is all the stuff we already have. Like, there's
Okay.
so much there that has not been, it's all been fully published, but not all deeply studied.
Okay.
So I get far more excited, like when I'm working with students and a student goes, you know what, there's this text that was discovered that nobody's talked about. Can we get into it? That to me is way more interesting than waiting for a new fragment in a new cave. I know that's a kind of better headline, but there's just so much in the scrolls that we haven't really dug into yet. I think the story's ongoing. I think new discoveries are often more problematic than they are helpful. So I'm
Okay.
happy to hunker down in the library with the stuff we already have most days, to be honest with you.
So would you say there's lots of room for dissertations in the Dead Sea
Yes.
Scrolls?
Yeah, no, there definitely is, and it's hard to not be the guy who's giving like the Dead Sea Scrolls altar call, like come on down, it's good, But honestly, there's I get excited about working with students in scrolls for many reasons, but one of them is I get to learn from them, and that's a really cool thing as a supervisor to have somebody who's going, I'm getting at a text that you don't know as much about as a supervisor, and I'm happy to help coach and learn with them because that's not always the case in a lot of disciplines. It's not always the case in biblical studies or theology. We have
Sure.
some fairly well-trod ground in a lot of areas without pointing fingers. But ours is there's a lot of fresh territory and published texts, but they've really not been dug into as much. So
Okay.
a lot of territory if you're looking for things like master's theses and dissertations and all of that, or if you're just curious, you don't have to go be an academic to enjoy the scrolls. There's a
Sure.
lot of good resources around now.
My work so far has been mainly in the Gospel of Mark. but coming up with a Markan proposal
Yeah.
feels next to impossible most days.
Yeah.
So I've been lately looking at Septuagint stuff,
Hmm.
and probably similarly, Dead Sea Scrolls would just
Yeah.
have a lot of
Well, and even both of those, like one of the exciting things about the scrolls I find is actually the opportunities that can be there for like cross-disciplinary tag teams.
okay,
That would be a non-technical way of putting it, but like so for example, like the gospel is a great example of this. The scrolls community was writing and living in and around call it like the first century BC to the first century CE and around that time. It with their texts are older than that as well in most cases. But if you look at that timeline, that overlaps significantly with the early Jesus movement. So the opportunity to go, if you take the Gospels, we have the benefit of four canonical Gospels as well as a growing understanding of other Gospels that were floating around or other early sources that might have been behind the Gospels. That's a really good position. Scholars would often call that the synoptic problem. I kind of laugh at my New Testament friends and say that's a synoptic opportunity. You got four gospels and all this other stuff. What are you complaining about? I've got small fragments. Like, go do your work. But there's a great opportunity to go, well, when we look at the gospels, how do we read them, or have we missed something? Have we misunderstood something? Could we read them differently? When we try to hear them in that ancient Jewish context, because surprise, surprise, Jesus and like almost all their followers were all Jews. They're part of the same world. That's why when we see him, in the Gospels, Jesus depicted as debating with the Pharisees or the religious leaders. They're debating things like purity, and as we just talked about, like purity is huge for this Qumran
yeah,
community. So there's a chance here to do these tag teams where you go, I'm my like 80% interest is New Testament. But what if we take this 20%, element of the scrolls and have that be an element to read that lens onto it? Then are there things that we can understand purity? Are there things that we can understand Paul's words differently? And Septuagint's the same way. Qumran in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have our earliest copies of almost every book of the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, except for Esther. That's the one kind of Dead Sea Scrolls factoid. But you take a book like Jeremiah. Jeremiah in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and the Septuagint. We knew that was had a short and a long version of it. Like you look at the Septuagint versus the regular Hebrew text, there's like a 13% difference. What we didn't know is both of those versions go back to Hebrew originals. We have in Cave 4 in the Dead Sea Scrolls four manuscripts of Jeremiah, and two of them look like the long version, and two of them look like the short version. So even if you're interested in, things like the textual history of the Bible and the textual history of a book, say like Jeremiah or Joshua or Psalms or whatever, and you think about the scrolls in Septuagint, those two things can go together really well. So
yeah.
it's not that you need to kind of go deep dive into the scrolls and that be the only thing. I think actually they're one of their primary areas of opportunity is going the scrolls and
Yeah.
New Testament, Septuagint, fill in the blank. So there's a lot there.
I'll have to think about that and maybe talk to you more
Sure,
about that
sure.
as time goes on. You call them in the title "Lost Words and Forgotten Worlds." Could you say what exactly did we lose, and what are
Yeah.
the things we're remembering now?
Yes. Yeah. It's interesting to think about. I'll maybe focus on the words and the worlds part, because the words. I think what I'm getting at there is, I think most readers of the scrolls or folks that might read this book are kind of interested in biblical history broadly defined. Whether that's Jesus, Paul, New Testament, Old Testament, but they're probably reading the Bible for a reason, and that's cool. So what is it? Do we know a lot about how those words came together? Our best Hebrew manuscripts. Well, first I'll say there's no New Testament text in the scrolls. They're before the New
Yeah,
Testament, so we can kind of carve that off the top. New Testament's great, awesome, but it's just not there because this is not a Christian community, and it was before the time that those writings were written. So when we say the textual history of the Bible in the scrolls, what I really mean is the Old Testament that the church reads. What was the background there? Translations of the Old Testament that you read today, and there's many, and many are great. They're using a base text called the Masoretic tradition, hugely important Hebrew text, the Leningrad Codex primarily, as well as the Aleppo Codex. Those are about 1,000 years old, which sounds pretty old to you and I, but it's actually not that old. The scrolls are like 2,000 years old. So all of a sudden we have words that are just rewound, another 1,000 years, a millennium back. And we can study those words. Are they the same? Are they different? Did they develop? How do we map that out? And that's an art and a science. That's why there's different translations of the Bible. That's why you have different scholars and professors and other folks that engage in Hebrew and Aramaic and Greek. That you're never going to agree fully on it. But there's those words now that we have all of a sudden. We wound back the clock to 1,000 years before we had in their original languages. So in the Old Testament, Hebrew and Aramaic, as well as like you mentioned, Septuagint, we have Septuagint texts. So those are the words that I think are probably most interesting to folks. The other part of that title is worlds, and this I think is I would almost argue more important because we have another way of looking at this. Say that scrolls we discovered new texts, but also new contexts. So that's kind of the parallel to that words and worlds thing, because the writings of the Old Testament, and we're just talking about the New Testament as well, they didn't drop from the sky, right? These are written in, with, through, and for contexts that in the ancient world are defined by things like empires. The Greco-Roman period, for example, or in the Old Testament, we have the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Persians. Life is complex. You and I probably both know that in our own ways from our own day, just by being humans. That's always been the case. So if we're trying to understand kind of the world of the Bible, all of a sudden the scrolls become very important because this is a community living in that world. It was not messy, or it was not easy. It was sometimes messy. We don't have to agree with all of their interpretations, but it's really interesting to say that we've not only recovered texts, manuscripts, but context, kind of that shaped some of those ideas, what people believed, how they practiced, what their hopes were. And that's kind of those two things in the title is I know when I think of scrolls, when I first, was getting into this, you run right to the words on the page and go, oh, we have these new words, but it's actually all the stuff around it that's as or more important, I would argue.
Are there theories as to where the Qumran community went to in New Testament times?
Yes. If you're, listeners are probably familiar with, groups like the Pharisees and the Sadducees in the New Testament. And that's where the New Testament is an invaluable resource for many things. One of them is because it's also speaking to what ancient Jewish culture and life was looking like.
Yeah.
Not in the same way as the scrolls, but it's also a source for that in the same way the scrolls are. The community of Qumran was likely associated with or part of an Essene movement.
Yeah.
So there's other writers in this period, like Josephus is an ancient Jewish historian. He talks, so is Philo. Philo's a philosopher and writer in Alexandria, but they both talk about Pharisees and Sadducees and Essenes, as well as other groups like this fourth philosophy that Josephus talks about. So the scrolls are written by a group that's probably a scribal community. They're living out in the wilderness. They're expecting that the divine rule of God is around the corner. They really disagree with the Jerusalem establishment, the temple. They've in fact separated themselves from it, and they're likely associated with this Essene movement. Now, unfortunately for them, the Romans kind of have one job, and it's keeping the peace, the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. If the Romans don't like anything, it's revolts. And by after, in the first century, they've been quelling revolts kind of up and down and up and down, up and down, like crucifying Jesus and the early Christians, right? That was, from the Romans' view, that was a revolt, and they were trying to quell it in some ways. There's another revolt that happens, and the Romans have had enough. They eventually topple the temple. The temple, they tear it down. That's the Second Temple in Jerusalem. And it seems like as they're chasing a group of rebels out in the wilderness, these Essenes got caught in the crosshairs and their community gets wiped off the map. So 68, 70 CE, those are the dates we have for this. What that means for us then is that the scrolls that were in the caves, as far as we know, became like an accidental time capsule
Okay.
because this community was like tragically wiped off the face of the earth by the Romans. Remember, this is the group that wrote this war scroll. They thought that God was going to show up and like smack down on the Romans, and they were gonna come on the right side of history. I can only imagine like the human like loss and the emotional toll of what that would have looked like and felt like. But their scrolls were kind of tucked away, and some of them very close by. Like Qumran Cave 4, which had the most manuscripts of all the caves, is quite literally within eyesight. You can see it from the community. It's right there, and as this community lost everything, their scrolls were tucked away. So they were likely scenes associated with the movement, and they had kind of an untimely end. But that time capsule, in a way, of their texts were, as far as we know, undiscovered for the most part for the better part of 2,000 years.
Were there other artifacts in the caves discovered that kind
Yeah.
of told of the life of the Qumran
Yes.
community?
Yeah, and that's a great question. I'm glad you brought that up, Riley, because one of the really important things about the scrolls as a discovery is we call them the Dead Sea Scrolls, but it's actually a discovery of manuscripts and archaeological artifacts.
Okay.
So there's this community, I've been saying Qumran, that's a place, that's the name of this archaeological site. That community had different phases of occupation, and there's a chapter in the book on archaeology of it, which is very interesting. But even within the caves, there are items that are found. So we have things like combs, right? We have things that give stories of human life like that. There's sandals. There's a whole bunch of pomegranate seeds as
Oh,
well. So that was
interesting.
part of the diet. But all these things, to me, like we're talking about, like the words, worlds, text, contexts, and even my kind of first kind of dive into the scrolls. What was one of the things that was so interesting and continues to be intriguing to me is uh, even if we're reading these texts with deep theological interest, which is totally fine and great, there also is a human story around it. And that all of a sudden, I find that more relatable sometimes because
Yeah.
when I look at this community that's interpreting the scrolls, and sometimes I go like, well, that was a strange interpretation. But as I grow in this, I try to go, oh, but what they're trying to do is they're trying to make sense of their inherited scriptures, traditions. They got all this wild stuff happening around them, like in this Roman period. Like there's a lot going on. They've got tensions with other groups. They're expecting that God is on their side and that will happen soon. They're trying to piece it all together. And guess what? They combed their hair and ate pomegranates. Like there's a human story here that I think is
Yeah.
very interesting. So your question, like, was there other stuff? Yeah, there was a lot of other stuff, and sometimes it's easy to miss that there's this other stuff that's part of the story. So that's why in that chapter on archaeology, I try to bring it to a level of some very basic things, like the example of the discovery of toilets and and things like this, and combs and seeds. A cemetery as well. If you're living on the wilderness and you're a community of any size, you're going to have folks that pass on. What do you do with that, and how does that look? So the whole archaeology of Qumran is a world of itself that, frankly, I'm at best a very early novice student because I'm not an archaeologist. But there's people that do this, and I've learned a lot from them. So my book's kind of a listening in on those conversations to
Yeah.
get us in there enough. But the other stuff is a whole other world of things that you can study with the scrolls for sure.
Yeah. I enjoyed that chapter because I feel like I've never heard about that part of the
Yeah.
Dead Sea Scrolls. Uh, when it comes to, excuse me, interpretation, are there consistent ways that the Qumran community read and interpreted the Old Testament,
Mhm.
and maybe ways that challenge how we read it today?
Yeah. Well, that was one of the things that I find most exciting about the scrolls is we've recovered a community that's thinking about scripture. So, our books of the Old Testament, it's not until about the fourth century of Common Era or AD that the Bible as we know it kind of starts to come together. So they're in a scribal culture before all that. Yet most of the books that we read as, authoritative scripture in the Old Testament seem to have also had this authoritative position for them. Again, there's nuance there, but for the most part, we can see that these books mattered. So you take a book like the Prophet of Habakkuk. Now Habakkuk, there's a scroll. Even if folks, if you Googled Pesher Habakkuk, Pesher Habakkuk scroll, you can find images of this. Even if you don't know Hebrew, it's a brilliant and beautiful manuscript. Just scroll through it, have a look at it, just to kind of see it on its own. The mechanics of this, though, this text, is it's not a copy of the book of Habakkuk. It's an interpretation of the book of
Okay.
Habakkuk. And what this style of interpretive text does, that's this style called pesher, that word pesher comes from the Hebrew that just means interpretation. So if you go to a library or buy a commentary on Amazon or wherever biblical commentaries today, they'll basically quote something, from Habakkuk 1 to 4 or whatever, and then they'll say, well, this means this, and they
Mhm.
interpret. Then they'll quote something and then they'll interpret. That's so routine for us. If you're used to being in a theological library at a college, a seminary, university, you know what a Bible commentary looks like. This is one of our early examples, kind of how that's starting to come together in a way. That's, again, a rough analogy, but in Pesher Habakkuk, this scribe would quote a few passages, and then he'd say Peshar, Pishro, its interpretation is, and then he would explain, here's what this means, here's what that piece means, here's what this means, here's what that means. But they're almost always doing it in light of their own world around them. Again, not unlike us. But they have two kind of fundamental principles that were quite distinctive there. One was they had a teacher of righteousness. This was like their founding figure. Early on in Scrolls research, there were some conspiracy theories like, was this Jesus? It's like, no, it wasn't Jesus. This was just their founding figure. But this founding figure, this teacher of righteousness, they believed he had a special revelation, an inspired interpretation, and an authority to fully understand the Torah and the Hebrew scriptures. So their interpretations always look back to this authority and try to make sense of the meaning of this passage. And the second thing is that they're quite clear in Pesher Habakkuk that they make the point that because we have this special interpretation, this inspired kind of teaching, even Habakkuk didn't know what this meant. Like its meaning was reserved for us. And this is what it means. So when you read something like Pesher Habakkuk, even in translation, I think these would be interpretations that you go like, well, that's quite out of left field. That's not what I would expect, Habakkuk to mean. But they were doing what interpreters generally throughout time try to do. They go, how do we make sense of this text? What's going on in the world around us? And how do we think it helps us kind of order the world and orient ourselves to it? So scriptural interpretations of Qumran, that's one example where it's quoting and commenting. There are other genres that kind of retell stories. If we go to examples like the Genesis Apocryphon, this is an Aramaic text. It's not quoting and commenting, this is what this means. It's kind of weaving interpretations as it retells the story, almost like a remake of a movie. Like if you go see a movie that was made 20 years ago and there's a new take on it, it's still the same movie, but it's remade and reimagined for a new audience. That's also quite common in the scrolls. So when we look at the scrolls, we like with all of those texts we have many different writings that are trying to interpret scripture, but they're not always doing it in the same way. But it's always interesting to go like, well, is that really that strange, or is there some rough analogy to what we do today? And
Mhm.
but again, it's not to connect dots necessarily, but it kind of does plug us into again the community context of a community trying to make sense of the world around them. They value their scriptural traditions, and they're trying to explain their present while hoping for the future. So a lot there in terms of how scripture is interpreted in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Definitely a cool area to explore.
Any obvious ways that their interpretation differed from Jesus in early Christians?
Yeah, yeah, great question. Because we also we were talking about the Gospels earlier, right? They're interpreting texts as well. Like you read Matthew, right? It's every every four syllables. It's like, well, as the prophet said, as Isaiah said, like they're weaving scripture into their understanding of Jesus and his teachings and his message and identity. So they're I don't mean this in a pejorative sense. They're playing at the same game, but like they're not that different in a way. What's interesting is when we look at messianic views in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So, spoiler alert for listeners, but Christ is not Jesus's last name, right? Like that Christos means Messiah, and in Hebrew it's Mashiach, right? This is the anointed one. The early Christians were not the only ones to have a messianic hopes. The Dead Sea Scrolls communities, Qumran community had messianic hopes as well. Some texts we find some similarities between what the New Testament describes as Jesus the Messiah and this group's expectation for a Messiah, like in Luke 7, when John the Baptist, is on death row and he asks Jesus, or he sends a runner, "Are you the guy?" And Jesus answers him with a combination of passages from Isaiah and Psalms, but he also hints that the resurrection of the dead will be part of this. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have a text. It's called 4Q 521. They all have archival names. It's a very boring archival name, but it's a great text. And it has that same list of things. Are they borrowing from each other? Or is the gospel, are they copying the Dead Sea Scrolls as Jesus has seen? No, 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 no. What's happening is they're part of the same cultural conversation. So they're aware that this is one model
Mm.
of messianic hopes, but they're applying it differently. Then we have your questions about other differences. There's a lot of differences because even in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's, three, four, five, six different takes on, how you would recognize the Messiah or Messiahs plural. There's a few passages where there's, this this kind of tandem messianic model of a Messiah of David and a Messiah of Aaron, and maybe a prophetic Messiah. And so I think as readers of the New Testament, um, I can say confidently 100% of readers of the New Testament today are not ancient Jews. I think that's a given. So part of what we are trying to do is reading it. When I read the New Testament, is go, when I hear, the writer of Luke describe Jesus in this way, have I really heard why he's saying it that way? And if I haven't, is there an opportunity to try to read around the New Testament and go, oh, that's what he's saying here? This is an example of where this was a messianic conversation in a way in that world. It's not to say that everything has to be the same to prove the New Testament or anything like that, but it does help us kind of get a handle on the conversation that's happening. Because, not picking on Luke, but Luke's one part of a bigger conversation. And if we can hear him better or more differently by listening into others around it, it's really
Yeah.
interesting. And so messianic expectations and models and theology is really cool in the scrolls. And there's a lot in there. I touch on that a little bit in the book, but that example in Luke is one where it's helped us see like, oh, he's not cooking this out of thin air. This is coming from a conversation, which is kind of cool.
Do you think the Son of Righteousness was a real man?
The
Or was
teacher
it,
of righteousness.
sorry, teacher of righteousness? Or
Yeah.
was it kind of a messianic hopeful figure in the
Yeah.
future?
Yeah, I think it's more. I think he was a person. He was a person. We know this because in some of the community writings, it's pretty clear that the way that this community kind of took root was there was a huge falling out between him and the man of the lie. The scrolls have great code words. Like I don't know if you ever had like a nickname growing up, but there's nothing worse than a bad nickname. You can't kick it, right? So the scrolls very rarely will say, "Oh, we're talking about this person." They use ciphers, code names. So this teacher of righteousness had a falling out with the man of the lie, and these seem to be two. There's like a power play, if you will, in the Jerusalem temple where the teacher of righteousness was kind of burned and stepped back and founded this community. So there's a historical element to that about this fallout and whatever happened and transpired. But then, as like most communities and most movements, as that person passes on, we don't have all the details on that. And there's a lot of debate or whatever. But that that memory of that authoritative voice, that authoritative persona, that kind of is continually shaped and remembered by them. And so even though he's not there, like you don't have, here's the teacher of righteousness sitting right over there, and the guy's name is Dave. Like it's not like that specific in the scrolls, but he's the memory of him is lingering and looming in a lot of ways and guiding kind of how they understand the world around them. So the whole getting back to the context, one of the things that can be challenging with the scrolls is things like ciphers. You kind of have or nicknames. You're kind of decoding. Like, are they talking
Okay.
about the Pharisees here? Are they talking about the Sadducees here? Who are they pointing the finger at? Because it's these code names that kind of keep it interesting. But they're definitely speaking into and coming out of a historical context with that figure and others.
Do the Dead Sea Scrolls mess with our idea at all of what books should be in the Bible, be in the Old Testament?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a really great question because I think a lot of folks, and maybe folks who listen on this channel, like you're interested in the scrolls is coming because you're interested in the Bible, and that's cool, and that's totally fine. So I'm not knocking that at all. And that's where my interest in the scrolls comes from, and often still comes back to. Um, in terms of how the Bible came together as a book, is a whole that's a whole area of study and dialogue that is really exciting. The scrolls come from a time that's before the technology of a book existed, right? So we talk about a codex. I think we take for granted how ingenious book technology is. You know, it's not. I'll get my dates wrong, and my New Testament colleagues are going to string me up on this, but I want to say it's not until about the second, third century till we have the technology of a book, the idea of putting stuff together and sewing it together in a codex. So, but the scrolls are pre-codex. They're also pre-canon, and the canon is the list of authoritative books for Christian traditions, Jewish traditions that we have a lot of literature, a lot of scriptures, but these are the ones. So we're before the canon, but before the codex. I think the biggest challenge many of us have, and it is when we get to some of the scrolls, is we don't live in that world. We live on the world of we have a canon, we have a codex. Also, we're on the other side of the technology of a printing press, so we don't understand scribal culture necessarily and how that comes together. But to your question, does it mess with kind of what we think about should be in the Bible? I don't think so. I think it gives us an opportunity to learn about that process because my hunch is most modern readers of the Bible that are reading the Bible from a position of faith, again, not knocking that, important, great, awesome. I do as well. But you never really ask, oh, this is where this book come from. Kind of important, right? And I think the scrolls, in my experience, can open up that dialogue a little bit rather than say, ah, we're pulling the rug from under you. I see this as much more of an opportunity to go. It's the same way that we look at quality ingredients, you know. If you want something that's tastes awesome, you're gonna start with good ingredients. Where do they come from? Like where did that come from? This is kind of like the push the metaphor too far here. This is like the farm to table approach. Like we want to know where scripture came from because if it
Mm.
really matters in the way we say it matters, then we should respect it enough to do some homework on where it came from. And to me, there are growing pains with that. I'm not minimizing it, but it's been a really cool opportunity because the scrolls kind of open us up into that world that's before the Bible to go, okay, how did stuff start to come together?
Yeah.
And then that can easily kind of bring us into conversations about, okay, here's the stages of that process of canonization that Jews and Christians that developed or went through differently over the centuries. And then there's things like the Reformation, right, which really changes for Protestant Christians the scope of Scripture. So the scrolls are kind of like chapter one in that big history. So I don't think it messes with it. I think it's more of an opportunity to go, can we try and engage and grow in our understanding of that process? Because if the
Yeah.
Bible matters, then let's look at where it came from and what's the backstory there.
So would you say for you, have the scrolls challenged or helped your idea that scripture was preserved faithfully?
Yeah, this is a great question too, because like getting back to earlier, we say like these lost words and text. Like, what do we mean by that? I think the scrolls, and maybe this is coming through in the conversation we're having. Often the scrolls give us a both and. Like
Okay.
so we'll start with on the one side, the scrolls we have, about a third of those manuscripts, about a third of those 930 manuscripts are of, what we might call biblical scrolls. So they relate in some way to books of the Old Testament. They show us there was a remarkable scribal culture of consistency,
Okay.
which is quite unexpected. You might think like like I said before, we're winding back the clock 1,000 years earlier. But logically, you might think, well, I bet you it's going to be drastically different because that's a long way back. That's a lot of manuscripts we don't even know in centuries, right? But remarkable consistency in a lot of texts. So I'll give you one example. The book of Isaiah. We all know the book of Isaiah. One of the first scrolls found in the Dead Sea Scrolls in Cave 1 is called 1Q Isaiah B. Now remember that B because we're going to talk about A in a minute. 1Q Isaiah B. Fragmentary Hebrew copy of Isaiah, one of our oldest copies. Not the whole book, but the fragments of it's quite well preserved as far as they go. When you compare that to that Masoretic text that's like 1,000 years or older or newer than I mentioned before, very similar, very, very, very similar in a way that's it's a bit odd and eerie how close they are. So I don't see any way around saying, well, the scrolls disprove the Bible. No, the scrolls actually help us understand the shape and details of Scripture in a lot of manuscripts, very close and consistent to what we had later. But remember, I said this is B. What about A? Well, 1Q is A, another scroll of Qumran is a good example of a scroll. And this is, if you any image of a scroll, this is probably the one you've seen. It's a beautiful manuscript. Google Great Isaiah Scroll, and you'll see pictures of it. It preserves the entire book of Isaiah, with some bits at the bottom of the manuscript that are rotted out. But in this scroll, it's every line we have on there is, reflects the 66 chapters of Isaiah. Not drastically different, but there are important differences as well. And these are called textual variants. So you can't have the scrolls saying, yes, everything's the same without going, yeah, but there are also important differences. Now, for me in my journey in that, I've found that navigating both of those things is actually very helpful
Okay.
because if you look at even in modern Bibles, if you're reading a translation of the Bible, so the NIV or the New Living Translation or the NRSV or the ABCDEFG, like pick one, like read the preface, read the preface, and the translators are telling you, hey, look, we went and did some homework so you don't have to. We went and looked at the medieval stuff, we looked at the Greek Septuagint, we looked at the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they're going to tell you that no two manuscripts are the same. Yet their job was, as translators, was to go, we're giving you the best text that we think is the best version of the oldest possible text. And then as you're reading, like if you go into Isaiah, for example, pay attention to the footnotes. Very few people actually pay attention to the footnotes in the Bible, in modern Bibles, but that's where they're telling you, hey, here's where we picked up a new detail from the scrolls or the Septuagint. So go read Isaiah 53:11. I won't spoil it for you, but go read Isaiah 53:11 in almost any modern Bible. In fact, any modern Bible that's worth the paper it's printed on, read Isaiah 53:11 and look for a footnote. And they're going to tell you, here's something that we didn't see before. We didn't know this detail before, yet we have it now from the scrolls, and it's reflected also in the Septuagint. So when I look at that, I see this, the metaphor I use is less a game of telephone, like, scribes down the line copying. And then, you know how telephone goes, like you're playing with the kids and stuff. The message keeps getting worse and weirder and worse and weirder. So you've always got a corrupted thing at the end. Inevitably, somebody says purple monkey dishwasher and the whole thing's ruined, right? That's not a good metaphor, though. The better metaphor here is that this is almost like a family recipe. It's copied down the generations because it means something, it matters, and there might be slight differences, but it's still the same recipe. And when we look at the scrolls, it's really a both and. And I don't think the differences we have there, none of them are upending, the history of theology. None of them are totally turning things over that, oh wow, we were way wrong and the Bible is not what we thought it was. No, it's been reliably transmitted. But we also can't have that without saying, and it comes from a scribal culture
Yeah.
where manuscripts had differences. So I see that as an opportunity then to learn and explore that and to pay attention. Like when we're reading your scriptures, like I said, read the intro. It's not going to be that long, and then go have a look at the footnotes. And all of a sudden, you'll fast forward your knowledge of the history of the biblical text by like a mile. So I don't know if that gets the question exactly,
Yeah.
but it's kind of that both and. And I think that's an opportunity for us.
So obviously it's affected Bible translation
Yeah.
in a lot of good ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Any modern Bible, and by that I mean by this point, pretty much every modern Bible,
Okay.
engages the scrolls. The first time this happened, so this said the scrolls were just starting to be discovered in the late 40s, starting in 1947. In 1952, I believe is the year, the Revised Standard Version. So we have the new Revised Standard Version now. That's a very very common Bible, but the Revised Standard Version was in it. I think it was going into its second version or something like that. Again,
Okay.
don't quote me the details. But this was right around the time that the scrolls were discovered and becoming known, and light bulbs were going on. Like, hold on a second, we have some ancient texts here that we didn't know about. But in 1952, the RSV was going to press, basically. And so, in their introduction, again, speaking about a guy who likes old stuff, reading old introductions to old Bibles, in their introduction, the translators say, like, there's this new discovery of the scrolls and their ancient texts. And I think they reference Isaiah, Habakkuk, and Psalms, and probably others. Like that, they don't know exactly, but they're flagging for the first time, as far as I'm aware, saying this stuff that's just coming to light now is so important that it will start to have a positive impact
Yeah.
on the Hebrew scriptures in the Old Testament. And now, decades on from that, 60, 70 years, whatever that would be, 70 years on, we really see that in modern Bibles that do this for the most part, do it differently, but for the most part, do it exceptionally well. The NIV would be a great example of this. The NRSV is a great example of this. That preface and those footnotes, that's almost more what you're paying for to kind of get a sense of how this comes together. So you'll see the scrolls in there a lot.
Did you by chance see Wesley Huff on the Joe Rogan podcast?
I did. Yeah, I did. So I don't know Wes, but kudos for him and mostly a great conversation. Like, to get the scrolls, Bible, and theology in a very public forum like that.
Yeah.
Again, you don't have to agree with everything in these conversations, but the fact that that's even a conversation and a space that's open to that conversation was very interesting to me. And I think we're seeing, for different reasons and differently in different spaces, like a resurgence of interest in going like, huh, well, what is all this stuff actually about? And is it, Is it what we think it is, or is there more, or is there something that nobody's telling us? And I'm not afraid of those questions. I think that's actually really cool.
Yeah,
So I think I was quite surprised to see that, mostly in a good way. Like if kudos to Wes and to Joe Rogan being like, we're gonna get this
yeah,
guy on here and talk about this stuff. I thought it was really, really interesting. That wouldn't have happened 5, 8, 10 years ago.
sure. Yeah. I mean, and it can't be too hard on him. You can't speak for 3 hours and not, or I would you mess something up. But
Yeah.
did he misspeak at all when he talked about the Isaiah scroll being word for word complete copy of the book of Isaiah?
Yeah, and that one and it's true. Like you do this enough to know too. Like for a format like this, it's not a doctoral seminar where you're going to get into
Yeah,
detail, right? You need to kind of paint in broad strokes to a degree, and he did a pretty good job of doing that. But that's why I like that example of 1Q Isaiah A and Isaiah B, because before we talk about thousands of other manuscripts, let's just look at two.
sure.
Two that were sitting right beside each other in the same cave from around the same time from the same scribal community, and they're not the same. Are they drastically different? Not necessarily, but are they carbon copies? No, they're not. So that's what I mean. It's like that both and, but I also get that from an apologetic perspective, which is not really like my wheelhouse. That's I
Yeah,
think, and I get that that's what his work is in, which is fine. And for Joe Rogan's podcast, like they have a that's they're not looking at this for an academic doctoral seminar. They're having a conversation over it. So I think it was mostly good in terms of painting broad strokes. But I would say no, it's not a carbon copy. It's not word for word. It's not the exact same. Uh, Go look at every Bible of the today, and you'll see that in the footnotes. Is
yeah.
that a problem? I don't think it's a problem.
Okay.
Is it an opportunity? Absolutely. So whether it was overstated or just needed to be stated a certain way for the medium in the audience
Yeah.
is probably what was going on there, I'd
But
expect.
that's interesting, that you thought, I mean, he's obviously a scholar or a coming up scholar, and he represented the Dead Sea Scrolls community well.
Yeah, I think I would say I was more glad to see that the Dead Sea Scrolls were in the conversation,
Yeah,
and even like I was at a conference last week with many other colleagues and friends and academics, and they're all good friends. Do I agree with everything they say? No. Is there any way to represent the entirety of scroll scholarship in one paper or one podcast? Absolutely not. Even the stuff I'm sharing here, will people disagree with me? Absolutely, but that's
sure.
okay. This is meant to be a conversation. If it was simple, we'd have a list of answers and then go from there.
Yeah.
So I think what I was most encouraged by was he engaged in the conversation. I was less concerned about did he get everything absolutely right, but it was just kind of cool to see that he opened that space up and that was a topic that was of interest. Was really interesting to me.
Could you say a word about the Book of Giants
Oh, I'd love to.
and other texts that kind of sound like Lord of the Rings ish? And
Yeah, yeah, I like that. Lord of the Rings is just yeah, and that's actually a great analogy in some ways, though. I don't know if Lord of the Rings fans will know there's all sorts of other books, Silmarillion, is that the kind of
yeah, yeah, yeah.
prehistory, yeah, right? So in a way, Book of Giants is kind of the Silmarillion to Genesis. It
Okay.
kind of that's what it's trying to do. We'll see if that works, but Book of Giants is a really interesting text. It's written in Aramaic. Aramaic was a common language of the Near East from about the 7th century on, even well into the New Testament times. Like this is why we're talking about the Gospels. This is why every now and then the Gospels will go, oh, by the way, in Aramaic, this means it's because they're coming from an Aramaic context. So the scrolls have 10 to 13% of the scrolls are written in Aramaic, which is already really cool. Among these manuscripts are several writings either associated with or written in the name of the ancestor Enoch. So remember in Genesis 6, there's this weird kind of Genesis 6, 1 to 4. Like speaking of things that are weird but important, this is one of those. Enoch walked with God and then God took him. Oh, and by the way, there was these angels that had lusty eyes after human women and they came down and birthed these giants. And then it just goes on like nothing happened. As a reader, I'm going like, what? Hold on, like back up the bus. What's going on? And that's what these scribes were doing in a way. They were kind
Yeah.
of backing up the bus and going, is there more going on here? And Enoch ascends to this larger than life status because they're reading that phrase that he walked with God as he had otherworldly visions and journeys. And that's really what the book of Enoch's about. The book of Giants is part of that kind of generative quality where the writings in the Book of Giants are actually telling the story of the flood from the side of the giants. So this is kind of like if we were to go see a superhero movie, but it's kind of like the villain movie, right?
Yeah.
Like this is their side of the story. And the Book of Giants, you have several named giants. Some of them might be familiar. The scribes named their giants after some Babylonian heroes like Gilgamesh. So you can see they're kind of making a jab at that empire in a way to say, oh, you think Gilgamesh is a hero? Well, he's kind of one of these half-breed giants that's going to get what's coming to him. But these giants have dreams of flooding forests and burning, and they have a dream of something written on stone and being washed away, and they're having nightmares. They don't know what these mean, but they know it's not good because in the ancient world, dreams were not just things you had because you ate some bad food. Generally, the understanding was they carried a message from the gods. So they're aware something's up and this is not looking good. These nightmares are telling us something. So they need to figure out what they mean. Eventually, through kind of a few of these conversations, they find Enoch, and Enoch interprets it for them. And I'll paraphrase here, but he basically says, "Not looking good, guys." Like the idea here, these dreams are that you were your bodies will die off in the flood, effectively, but your spirits will be judged at the end of time. And Book of Giants is kind of retelling that story. It's fragmentary in the scrolls in Aramaic, but we also know about Book of Giants materials that show up in some rabbinic literature,
Okay.
as well as that show up much later in some late Persian dialects in northwestern China at a site called Turfan. So to me, like we're talking about again earlier, but like lost words and worlds and contexts, all of a sudden we've gone from this weird little passage in Genesis to some scribes going, is there something more we can interpret here? To this really cool book, Book of Giants, to traditions that travel, in this case, through a group called the Manichees, the Manichaeism, traveled all the way eventually to northwestern China. To me, that's just cool.
Yeah.
So that's where the scrolls, I think, open up some of those conversations and avenues. But for several reasons, I think Enoch and Book of Giants has become almost like a pop culture interest in the
Yeah.
last, decade or so. I think it's this otherworldly element of it that has captivated folks' interest. But yeah, Book of Giants, I touch on that a little bit in my my scrolls book because it's just a cool read, and it kind of gets to that space of yeah, if it's weird, it's important, and what did scribes do when they came across something like that?
So for someone, with no Dead Sea Scrolls background, no Hebrew, no
Yeah,
Aramaic, where would you suggest someone starts with? Because it's a pretty daunting
totally is.
world
Yeah.
to just
Yeah.
jump into.
Yeah, no, it is definitely a daunting world to jump into. I have a YouTube channel and I have some materials on there, but I just put a video up a few weeks ago on even just decoding the names
Okay.
of these. Like that one I said, oh, it's 4Q521. That all means something, but if you unless you're deep in this world, you go like, I have no idea what that means, let
Yeah.
alone how to find it. So I have some stuff like that. But in terms of what I've read the scrolls, there's two books I'd really recommend. So my book is an intro to this world of the scrolls, and that'll give you everything you need to kind of be like the tour guide. Like here's archaeology, here's Old Testament text, here's interpretation, here's some Aramaic, here's some New Testament stuff. It's going to give you that tour guide. But a guide to what? You need the actual text in translation.
Okay.
So there's two books I'd recommend. Both are fantastic and they're by excellent scholars. The first is called the Dead Sea Scrolls Bible. I'll give the last names of the authors are Abegg, Flint, and Ulrich. So Marty
Like
Abegg,
Peter
Peter
Flint.
Flint. Yeah, Peter Flint and,
Oh,
and
great.
Eugene Ulrich. So that book will give you translations of, more or less all the quote unquote biblical scrolls. So if
Okay.
you're interested in like they were talking about Isaiah, if you're interested in that or Psalms or Deuteronomy or Jeremiah, like pick one. They'll give you an introduction to that book from the perspective of what the scrolls have. They'll give you translations and they'll give you those footnotes. Like I was saying, pay attention to the footnotes. Definitely pay attention to them here because they're going to say, here's where the new thing is in the scrolls, or here's what the Septuagint says. And so that'll give you everything you need for those, biblical scrolls. But the other big part of the Dead Sea Scrolls is all the other texts. So the other, like Pesher Habakkuk we are talking about, or those messianic texts or community texts. You'll find all of these in a volume called The Dead Sea Scrolls, A New Translation. And that's by Abegg, Wise, and Cook.
Okay.
So those two, and they're both like HarperCollins, so these aren't gonna like you're not gonna like mortgage your house to have to buy these books. They're pretty accessible. But between those two books, you'd be able to read as deep and broad as you'd like in the scrolls. They all have introductions. They all have some very helpful things like how to read a Dead Sea Scroll. What are some things you might see here that look different from reading your Bible, for example. So if you have those two books as the primary sources and my book as the guidebook, you'd have everything you need to kind of get into the scrolls for yourselves and have some context around them. But I would say the fourth thing I would really advocate for, and this one's totally free and anybody can do it if you have a computer or smartphone, go to Google the Leon Levy Dead Sea Scrolls Library.
Okay.
So that's Leon Levy Dead Sea Scrolls Library, digital library, something like that. Google will figure it out. It'll get you the rest of the way there. And what this is the Israeli Antiquities Authority. About 10 years ago, they were deep in a project of digitizing almost all of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Even if you don't know Hebrew, even if you don't know Aramaic, Greek, that does not matter. If you do, have fun, it'll be great. But one of the things that I find so incredible with the scrolls, and I find this as a researcher or when I'm talking to folks or teaching, let's not forget these are material objects. And some of them are incredible to look at. Even if you don't know the language, just looking at a manuscript can really, I don't know, spark new thoughts in your head about like, I wonder why that thing looks that way up there. How come that part over there is deteriorated? Spending some time just clicking through scrolls, that's like almost the equivalent of like a day at the digital museum, and that's free. It doesn't cost anything. So you can read about the scrolls in my book, you can read the scrolls in those two other books, and then you can see the scrolls online for yourself. And that would be, I think, more than a crash course. You'd be doing things and seeing things you'd never have been able to see even a decade ago.
Last question. Are you an advocate for Christians reading the Dead Sea Scrolls, having a
Yeah,
knowledge of them? You think it's kind of just if you have an interest, or do you think it's an important thing for Christians to at least
yeah.
dip their toes into?
Yeah, I absolutely do. It's been helpful for me, not just like like professionally as an academic, but like this has really shaped a lot of my thinking about the Bible and
Okay.
theology. And the Bible is an absolutely essential, important book. And if we can add to our experience with it by reading around it, understanding it, how it came together, because it matter what the Bible means for today really matters. Arguably, one of the best ways we do that is by understanding what it meant in the past,
Yeah.
how it came together in the past. Then we can ask, what does it mean today? And I find things like the scrolls or the Septuagint or some of the things we've been talking about, they're part of that. What has the Bible meant story, and how do we dive into that? I find this to be a hugely additive opportunity on the whole. Does that mean there's not going to be growing pains? No, there absolutely will be, but that's the life of faith, frankly, is learning to dive deep and think well with the Bible. The scrolls can be a really cool sparring partner for that, regardless of your interest. So yeah, short answer, yes. Long answer, definitely yes.
Okay. Well, thank you, Andrew, so much for the book, Lost
Yeah.
Words, Forgotten Worlds, Rediscovering the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's been I haven't spent much time in them, and it's for me been that daunting kind of thing. So it's been a
Yeah.
hugely helpful book for me. And you write in a very, I don't know, accessible, humorous, interesting way. So I really
Good.
appreciate it. Recommend it. And
Great.
thanks
I'm
for
glad to
taking the
hear it.
time to chat today. I appreciate you.
No, thanks for having me on, and I hope the book's a good invitation into this world for listeners, because it's an exciting space to step into. So yeah, thanks for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, you bet.